The sun lay heavy on the horizon, bleeding rust across the sky, as if the land itself had been branded by some old wound. Heat shimmered from the earth, and the dust carried the smell of dry sage and sweat. She stood barefoot in the dirt, her dress threadbare, her hair pulled back with a strip of cloth that had once been blue but now looked closer to ash. Around her ankles, the grit clung like chains. She swayed but did not fall. Pride kept her upright where hunger might have dropped her. In her chest, her heart beat slow and stubborn, refusing to surrender though every part of her begged for rest. The auction had been small, just a scattering of ranchers and drifters, men with hard eyes and harder lives. They had come for cattle, for tools, for odds and ends left behind by families too beaten down to stay. But when her name was called, she felt the earth tilt. A voice announced her not as a woman but as a possession, a mouth to feed, a body to trade. She kept her chin high, even as the heat burned the back of her neck. One bid came, $2, no more, no less. The others shuffled, spat into the dirt, looked away as if ashamed of their own silence. $2. That was what she was worth to the world. The man who placed it stood apart, a cowboy with shoulders carved by years of work and eyes the color of old iron. He did not glance at her when his bid was taken. He did not smile at his purchase. He only nodded once, curt, final. The gavel came down, and with it, a chapter of her life slammed shut. When the crowd dispersed, she was led to him. No hand reached for hers, no word of welcome came. Only a nod toward the horse tethered nearby. She climbed up behind him, clutching the saddle horn with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of having nothing left to lose. The leather creaked beneath her fingers, and as the horse started forward, the horizon shifted, carrying her into a life she could not yet imagine. The ride stretched long, silence stitched tight between them. The plains opened wide, endless as an empty promise. Wind swept the grass flat, and in the distance, a lone hawk circled as if measuring the time left in her bones. She wondered if this man had bought her out of pity, out of some strange mercy, or if she was just another chore to him, like mending fences or driving cattle. Her pride stung. $2. The words drummed in her head like hoofbeats. By nightfall, they reached his land. It was not much a low-slung cabin of rough-hewn logs, a barn weathered gray, a corral where a few cattle shifted in the dim. The place smelled of leather, sweat, and the faint sweetness of hay. It was lonely land, worn by wind and silence, yet it bore the marks of stubborn labor. Fences patched by steady hands, fields turned with patience. This was not wealth, but it was survival. He dismounted first, then offered a hand. She hesitated. His palm was calloused, rough with work but steady. She placed her own in it, surprised at the firmness with which he lifted her down. He did not let go too quickly, nor too long. Just enough to steady her feet on ground that did not yet feel her own. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner. The walls bore no decoration, no softness, only the marks of use. He set a tin plate on the table and filled it with stew from a pot simmering low on the stove. The smell made her stomach twist with both hunger and shame. She had not eaten since the morning before. She sat, hands folded, waiting. He slid the plate across to her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. "Eat," he said. "Just that, nothing more." She did, each bite slow, careful, as if afraid she might wake from a dream. He did not watch her, only sat across the table and ate his own share. The silence was heavy, but not cruel. It was the silence of 2 people who had seen too much, lost too much, and had no words left for ceremony. When the plate was empty, she set it down with trembling hands. A part of her wanted to cry. Another part wanted to stand tall, to prove that $2 could not measure the worth of a woman who still carried her spine straight and her spirit unbroken. She would not be pitied. She would not be erased. And as the night folded around them, she knew one thing with certainty. She was not here to be owned. She was here to survive, and survival had always been her kingdom. She woke before dawn, not to an alarm or a rooster, but to habit, the kind that came from years of having no one to rely on but herself. The room wore a faint chill, and the smell of wood smoke. She lay still a moment, listening to the breath of the wind along the chinks in the logs, the faint clatter of a horse shifting in the corral. For a heartbeat, she thought of the auction yard again, the way the heat had pressed down, the cough of someone swallowing dust, the casual turn of a stranger's wrist that made her life change direction. $2. She let the words pass through her mind like water over stone, and then, deliberately, she let them go. In the gray light, she rose and moved quiet as a shadow. She found the pump and carried buckets, hands numbed by the iron handle. She swept the hearth and stirred the banked coals to coax a flame. Flour lived in a tin on the shelf. She measured by memory and made a rough dough. By the time the first light pushed against the window, the skillet hissed, and the smell of frying bread lifted into the cold. She did not think about being watched. She did not think about earning her keep. She simply worked, because working was a language she had never forgotten how to speak. He came in from the corral with dust on his boots and a line of morning frost along the brim of his hat. He set his gloves on the table and washed at the basin, the water shining like winter glass. She noticed the scar along his forearm, thin and pale, a memory of barbed wire or a bad throw with a roped steer. He nodded once at the food. The nod was not approval, it was acknowledgement, as if to say, "We both know what needs doing." They ate in the same plain quiet as the night before. The bread was coarse, the coffee strong enough to bite back, the silence different now, less like emptiness, more like a field newly harrowed, waiting. When they finished, he gathered the dishes and she let him. It was not kindness, she decided. It was order. Two lives fitting their edges without fuss. Work filled the day. Fences sagged from wind and age. She steadied posts as he tamped earth with the weight of his boot. In the barn, she learned where the tools hung and where the grain was kept. She lifted what her body could manage and left what it could not. There was a calf with a weeping eye. He tied the small head firm and she held the lamp while he cleaned the infection with a steady hand. The animal's breath warmed her wrists. When it was done, he loosened the rope and the calf nuzzled his sleeve with blind trust. A softness moved across his face and was gone before it fully arrived. Like a cloud passing over Sunday, the labor lulled her guard, and in the spaces between one task and the next, memory returned. A house with peeling paint. A man who used gentleness only when it suited him, and the back of his hand when it did not. Hunger measured out in thin bowls, the sound of a door closing, counted steps on a stair, the slow arithmetic of leaving. She remembered a winter night when the stove died, and she burned a wooden chair to keep breath from clouding into stillness. She remembered the way shame had no weight in the hand, and yet could crush a chest to splinters. She also remembered other things. A patch of wild sunflowers taller than a child, the way their faces followed the bright without argument. A neighbor woman who left a warm loaf on a sill and never asked a question. A creek shallow as an ankle that sang like a silver bell when the spring melt came. There had been strength in her even then. She had not chosen to be sold, but she would choose everything that came after. At noon they rested in the lee of the barn. Wind combed the prairie into ripples, and hawks sketched lazy circles in the high blue. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and untied it. Inside lay a disc of metal, dull with handling. He turned it over in his palm once, twice, as if confirming it was still real. She did not ask. She had learned that questions can be as heavy as stones. Later, when the sun leaned west and shadows grew long, he led her to the back acre where a row of cottonwoods marked a line between grazed pasture and fallow field. The leaves chattered in a soft, ceaseless gossip. There, at the base of the middle tree, the earth rose in a careful mound. The dirt had settled but not yet hardened. She understood then. Loss lived here, quiet and rooted. She kept her hands at her sides and her eyes on the tree's shaking light. A long time passed in a short span. He said nothing, only took off his hat and held it against his chest. The evening work came like a tide. She mended a tear in a work shirt with small, even stitches, the needle flashing like a sliver of moon. She set to scrubbing the table smooth and clean. When darkness dropped, they ate again stew and bread and a slice of peach put up in a jar months before. The sweetness shocked her tongue. She closed her eyes and let it rest there, not hurrying the moment. He watched, not unkindly, and turned away to tend the stove. In the night she lay awake, listening to coyotes far off and the creak of timbers as the cabin settled. She pictured the road behind her, long and marrow-hollowing, and the road ahead, unmarked but not empty. $2 had brought her to this place, but the measure of a life was not coin. It was the weight of water carried, the fence mended so the calf did not wander, the meal shared without spectacle. It was a man removing his hat before a cottonwood. It was a woman who would not break even when the world decided she could. Before sleep took her, another thought came, quiet as the brush of a moth's wing. Strength did not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrived as steady hands and good tools, as bread at dawn and a lamp held close to a frightened eye. She felt something uncoil in her chest, not hope exactly, but the space where hope might live. The next morning broke with a veil of silver mist lying low across the fields. The air smelled of damp earth, of grass still heavy with dew. She stepped outside with a pail, the handle biting into her fingers, and the cool morning air cut into her lungs sharp as river water. Somewhere beyond the fog, a cow lowed, deep and mournful. She found the rhythm of the pump, the squeak of iron, and the sudden rush of water filling her bucket. Her reflection bent and shattered on the surface as she carried it back. He was already saddling the mare, the leather cinch groaning as he pulled it tight. He glanced up only once, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, then turned back to his work. No words passed between them, but the silence had grown less brittle. There was recognition now, like the nod between two travelers who meet on the same lonesome road. By midday, she found herself moving with purpose. She tied her skirts back and lifted bales alongside him. She cleaned the stalls with the ease of someone who had never been afraid of dirt. When he saw her hauling more than her frame should have allowed, he opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. She caught the flicker of something almost like respect. Later, they rested under the porch roof, the boards rough beneath their boots. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, the sun slanting across her face. A silence stretched. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant. "My father built this place with his hands. Every fence post, every wall. He thought it would last longer than it did." She turned, watching the smoke drift. What happened? Drought, sickness, graves out back. His jaw tightened, and he stubbed the cigarette against the step. "But it's still here, and I'm still here." She did not answer. Words were not needed. She knew the language of loss too well. Instead, she reached down and let her fingers trail along the porch rail, rough with splinters, steady under her touch. She thought of her own, past the room she had left behind, the faces she no longer allowed herself to picture. She thought of the moment she had been sold for less than the price of a pair of boots, but she would not let shame carve her hollow. If this land could hold against storm and drought, so could she. The days pressed forward, each one stitched together by work. She rose before dawn and rested only after the last dish was cleaned. Her body hardened to the rhythm, aching shoulders, blistered palms, muscles she had forgotten she owned. Yet there was a strange satisfaction in it, a pride she had not felt in years. The land asked everything, but it also gave back. At night she would fall into sleep with the scent of hay in her hair and the echo of hoofbeats in her ears. It was in these days that the smallest gestures grew weight. The way he set an extra cup of coffee by her hand without asking. The way she folded his shirt and left it on the chair by the stove. Once, when a storm rolled in sudden and violent, she struggled with the barn door, the wind snapping it like a whip. He came from behind, his hand covering hers. Both of them braced against the gale until the latch held. Their shoulders pressed together, the rain lashing their faces. For a heartbeat, they stood as one body against the storm. That night, as thunder cracked over the plains and the roof rattled with rain, they sat by the fire. The light flickered over his face, softening the harsh lines etched there. He spoke of his dream not of riches or cities, but of building a herd strong enough to pass down, of keeping the land alive when so many had walked away. She listened, her eyes on the fire, and for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future not measured by escape, but by staying. Still, shadows lingered. When she went to town with him for supplies, whispers followed. Women turned their heads, men stared too long. She heard the snicker of one voice. $2. The words stung, but she did not falter. She carried the sacks with her chin high, her gaze unbroken. Yet that night, lying awake, the shame crept back, pressing hard against her ribs. She wondered if she had been foolish to believe that labor and dignity could erase what the world had branded her. But then she remembered the way he had stood with his hat in hand beneath the cottonwoods, the weight of silence heavy as prayer. She remembered his steadiness when the storm threatened to tear the barn apart, and she realized that value could not be measured in coin or in whispers. Strength was not something given, it was something carried, like water in a bucket, like pain turned into resolve. When she finally closed her eyes, the rain had stopped, and the night air was thick with the smell of wet earth. She dreamed not of the past, but of the sound of hammers driving nails, of fences rising strong, of a home that no one could sell or take away. The prairie burned gold beneath the late summer sun, the air shimmering with heat, cicadas thrumming their endless chorus. She moved through the day with sleeves rolled, arms browned by labor, hair damp with sweat. What had begun as survival was becoming something else, belonging. The rhythm of chores had shaped itself into a quiet partnership. He mended saddles while she patched shirts. She drew water while he stacked hay. Their silences were no longer voids, but spaces where trust could take root, steady and unsaid. One evening, as shadows stretched long, she carried a basket of laundry toward the line. Her steps slowed when she saw him by the corral, bent over the flank of a restless colt. The animal tossed its head, eyes rolling white, hooves tearing divots in the earth. He held the rope taut, voice low, calm but unyielding. She could feel the tension in the air, the horse straining against its tether, the man refusing to give ground. Her heart clenched, not out of fear for him but in recognition. She knew that fight, the wild panic of something that refused to be broken. Without thinking, she set down the basket and stepped closer. Her voice, when it came, was soft as dusk. Easy now. The colt's ears twitched. She moved slowly, her hands open, her gaze steady. She had soothed frightened creatures before, not with strength, but with presence. The horse snorted, pawed, then stilled enough for him to tighten the halter. When he looked up, his eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. Respect. Later, at the table, he broke the silence. "You've known hard stock." She lifted her eyes from her plate. "I've known harder." Her voice held no bitterness, only truth. For the first time, he allowed a small smile to touch his mouth, fleeting as a shadow. She felt warmth rise in her chest, not from the stew, but from the acknowledgement that her strength was not invisible. But the outside world did not stay quiet. Word of their union spread beyond the small town, and with it came judgment. When she walked the narrow streets, she felt the weight of stares pressing against her back. Some pitied, some mocked. A rancher's wife muttered near the well, $2 buys little more than a burden." The words landed sharp, but she did not flinch. She carried her pail, shoulders square, and let silence be her answer. Still, doubt wormed its way into her nights. Lying awake, she wondered if she had bound herself to another kind of prison, if whispers would always follow her shadow. Some mornings she caught her reflection in the water bucket face lined by sun and wind, eyes marked by years of hunger and endurance, and asked herself whether she was truly free. It was during these nights of unease that he surprised her. He spoke more than before, his voice low, almost awkward, as though unused to shaping such words. He told her about his brother who had left for the war and never returned, about the seasons when crops failed, and he buried hope with each shallow grave dug behind the cottonwoods. He confessed how loneliness could hollow a man, until even the sound of his own voice grew foreign. Listening, she realized his silence had never been indifference but defense. Pain had taught him to keep his heart guarded, and in that recognition she felt the distance between them narrow. Their bond deepened through the work itself. Together they fought the land and weather, pulling calves from mud, stacking hay against storms, tending to the fragile sprouts of corn that dared the prairie wind. Each challenge tested them, and each time they endured, something unseen but sturdy wove tighter between them. But the harshness of the frontier never let them forget how fragile peace could be. One afternoon, as she hung sheets to dry, riders appeared on the horizon, 3 men, strangers, their approach deliberate. The wind carried the jingle of spurs, the smell of dust and leather. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his posture straight and wary. She froze, heart hammering, the clothespin slipping from her fingers. The men reined in, faces shadowed by wide brims. Their leader spat into the dirt and called out, "We hear you bought yourself a wife for cheap. Seems a shame to waste good coin on something so used." The words split the air like a whip. Heat surged in her throat, shame and fury braided tight. But before she could speak, he answered, voice hard as iron, "This land's mine. My choices are mine. You'll ride on." The men laughed, cruel and sharp, but when his rifle lifted a fraction higher, they shifted in their saddles. After a moment too long, they turned, spitting curses into the dust as they rode away. Her knees weakened, but she stood. When he lowered the gun, his hand shook slightly. She stepped closer, laying her palm over his. His skin was rough, warm, and trembling. Their eyes met, and for the first time, words rose unbidden to her lips. $2 never bought what you see standing here. For a breath, silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Then he squeezed her hand, not gently, but firmly, as if anchoring both of them against the storm of the world. That night, when the house settled into its quiet creaks and the stars spilled endless above, she felt the shape of a vow forming inside her, not born of obligation, not chained by coin, but forged by choice. Whatever the land demanded, whatever scorn others cast, she would not turn away. Here, she had found something that might be more than survival. Something that might one day be called love. The first frost came early that year. One morning she stepped outside and the grass was edged with white, brittle beneath her boots. Her breath curled in the air, and the land itself seemed to pause, waiting for winter's hand. She pulled her shawl tight and carried wood to the stove, the logs knocking heavy against her hip. Inside, the cabin warmed slow, the fire licking the cold from the corners. He entered not long after, shoulders dusted with frost, his face raw from the wind. He set a bundle of kindling by the door and removed his gloves. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet acknowledgement, then fell back to the tasks of the morning. Yet beneath the silence ran a current neither of them could ignore. The days shortened, work grew harder, and with it came the unspoken test of their bond. Supplies ran low. The nearest town had little to spare, and whispers there had sharpened into scorn. Men muttered loud enough to be heard. Women drew their children closer as she passed. Once, a boy tossed a pebble at her skirt and laughed. She kept walking, her face steady, though her hands shook until she reached the edge of town. That night, doubt gnawed at her. She sat by the fire, staring at her raw palms, the skin cracked and bleeding from cold and work. "Perhaps they're right," she whispered, her voice so low it seemed swallowed by the crackle of flames. "Perhaps I was nothing more than what they paid." He looked up from where he was mending tack, his jaw tightening. "Don't speak that way." Her eyes lifted, wet and fierce. "Then tell me, what am I to you?" The room held its breath. He set the leather aside and leaned forward, the firelight throwing shadows across his face. "You're the one who rises before the sun, who keeps this place alive with your hands. You stood against strangers without flinching. You're no burden. No man can put a price on what you are." Her throat ached with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him, yet the memory of the gavel, the sound of that paltry bid, still echoed in her bones. But when his hand reached across the table and closed over hers, rough and firm, she felt something shift. The weight of shame loosened, replaced by the steady anchor of his grip. Winter pressed in. Snow came heavy, blanketing the world in silence. Together they faced it, chopping wood until their muscles screamed, hauling water through drifts, huddling by the stove when the wind shrieked like a thing alive. Hardship had a way of binding or breaking. For them, it bound. Nights were long, but conversation began to slip through the cracks, memories of his childhood, fragments of her past she had never dared share. He spoke of his mother singing hymns while sewing by lamplight. She told him of a creek where she used to wade barefoot, the stones smooth and cool beneath her feet. Small things, but each one a thread, weaving them closer. Then came the sickness. One morning he could not rise, his body burning with fever, his breath ragged. Fear clawed at her chest, but she did not falter. She boiled water, brewed herbs, wiped sweat from his brow with trembling hands. Days blurred into nights as she sat by his side, coaxing him to drink, whispering prayers she had not spoken in years. At times he rambled in delirium, calling names she did not know, pleading with ghosts she could not see. She answered with steadiness, anchoring him to the living world. When at last the fever broke, his eyes opened to find her still there, hollow-eyed but unyielding. He rasped her name not with ownership, but with gratitude, reverence even. In that moment she understood. He was no longer the man who had paid for her, and she was no longer the woman sold. They had become something else, partners, forged by fire and frost. Spring returned slow, the thaw turning fields into rivers of mud. Shoots of green pushed stubborn through the softened earth. She walked the land one morning and felt a quiet certainty rise within her. This place was no longer a prison. It was a beginning. Weeks later, he took her to the cottonwoods. The ground was greening, the leaves trembling like new hope. He carried nothing but a small band of silver, worn thin by years, once belonging to his mother. His hands shook as he offered it, voice low. "I have nothing fine to give you, but I'll give you what I have: my name, my land, my life." Her eyes blurred, the weight of everything they had endured pressing in at once. She slid the ring onto her finger, the metal cool, the meaning warm. "I was never bought," she said softly. "I chose this." The wind stirred the leaves above them, whispering like a blessing. They stood together, not bound by coin or shame, but by vow freely spoken. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon and the fields shimmered with new life, she leaned against him on the porch, his arm wrapped steady around her shoulders. Before them stretched the land, harsh, demanding, beautiful. Behind them lay graves, whispers, scars. Between them, a bond that no auction could measure. The world would remember the price, perhaps, but they would remember something else, that love, like the prairie, endures not because it is easy, but because it refuses to break.